Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, men and women. It's I, Clint Fellow. You can call me Clinton or Clint or the Fellow or just the poet. Today we're going to do random poem number 4, fantasy, where I'm going to tell you the difference between what is fantasy and fantasy is sometimes good, sometimes bad. But I'd rather live in reality, really, because sometimes fantasy comes true and it's all right, but it doesn't last that long because you expect it to always be like a fantasy. But life is not always like a fantasy. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, but you have to accept it the way it is. All right, and here goes. Random poem number 4 from me, Random Fellow, on this channel. Fantasy. Fantasy can be fantastic. Fantasy can be unrealistic. Fantasy can be good. Fantasy can be bad. Fantasy can't feed you. Fantasy can't heal you. Fantasy is not reality. Fantasy is nowhere to live. Fantasy is nice to be. That's a nice place to be, that's for sure. Fantasy is nice to be. Fantasy is only momentary. Don't live in fantasy. Now let's read it one more time. Fantasy. Fantasy can be fantastic. Fantasy can be unrealistic. Fantasy can be good. Fantasy can be bad. Fantasy can't feed you. Fantasy can't heal you. Fantasy is not reality. Fantasy is nowhere to live. Don't live in fantasy. That's nowhere to live. Fantasy is nice to be. It's nice to be in fantasy sometimes, just for a moment, okay? Fantasy is only momentary. It's good to have a momentary fantasy, like, I wish I had $1 million. I can do this and that. That'd be so awesome. But don't live in that. Live in it just for a moment, but don't try to live in it forever. Even if you did have $1 million, don't blow it. Okay? Because don't live in fantasy. It's better to live in reality. Okay? So, just remember that. Fantasy versus reality. Okay? Reality is sometimes cruel. It's sometimes bad. But in reality, you can't use fantasy to feed yourself. The only way to feed yourself is to get food. And usually that's to buy it. You must have income. You can't just fantasize $1 million falling out of the sky and suddenly $1 million falls out of the sky and there you have food. And if $1 million does fall out of the sky, you'll probably have to report to someone because you'll probably get in trouble for finding $1 million and try and explain where it came from. So let's read that one more time straight through. Fantasy. Fantasy can be fantastic. Fantasy can be unrealistic. Okay? Fantasy can be good. Fantasy can be bad. Fantasy can't feed you. Fantasy can't heal you. Fantasy is not reality. Fantasy is nowhere to live. Fantasy is nice to be. Fantasy is only momentary. Don't live in fantasy. It's okay to be there once in a while, but don't live there. Okay? You can have a fantasy about have a beautiful boyfriend or a girlfriend or handsome boyfriend, a handsome girlfriend or whatever, because beauty. A man can be beautiful, just like a woman can be handsome. Okay, a handsome woman is usually someone who's able to not only look beautiful on the outside, but they could work with their hands. That's what handsome originally meant. And beauty, men and women were both beautiful. Like myself, I'm beautiful, but I'm also handsome because I know how to use my hands. Anyhow, but see, fantasy can be fantastic. Great. It's great to have fantasy of a goal, like say, I want to do this in 5 years. Or I want to get a car because I need one. That's a good fantasy. It can be fantastic. It can be unrealistic too. Oh, I want to be a millionaire or a billionaire. That could be unrealistic. You don't need to go like that. You should go like maybe $1,000. I'll work for $1,000 or save $1,000. Maybe that'd be a better fantasy or closer goal to your, what do you mean? I wish I had a unicorn or a flying horse. That's completely unrealistic. So fantasy can be unrealistic. Fantasy can be good. Oh, I imagine, getting a better job or living in a better place. That's a good fantasy. Fantasies can be bad. I would imagine I'm living in a fantasy with living in a mansion. I mean, as a fantasy with fantasy bride, a fantasy bunch of children. with a butler and all this, maids and stuff. That can be bad because you're greedy and you're going to be disappointed if it doesn't happen. Fantasy cannot feed you. You can imagine a big juicy turkey or something that you like to eat, all nice and ready for you to eat. You can fantasize all you want about it, but it cannot feed you. It's not real. Fantasy can't heal you. If you cut yourself, you need a Band-Aid or go to a doctor who's really bad, but you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to fantasize my arm's all right, my cuts disappeared. It's not real. Fantasy is not reality. All right? Fantasy is nowhere to live. You live in fantasy land, you'll starve to death because you'll forget to eat and you'll sit there and just stare in space. Some people do that and they go completely bonkers. Fantasy is nice to be there sometimes, like you dream, oh, that's wonderful. Even if you had a good dream, that's like a fantasy. That's nice once in a while because fantasy is only momentary. It can't stay because life is not always good. It's not always bright and sunny, shiny. You have to take the rainy days with the sunny days, the good with the bad. So don't live in fantasy. I'm Clint Fellow, and this has been Random Poem number 4, Fantasy, and I'm Random Fellow. And if you like this video, thumbs up. If you don't like it, thumbs down. Comment, suggestions, ask me questions. Check out the other channels under channels, feature channels, or look under about. You can follow Gerson on Facebook, Twitter, MySpace, Instagram, so forth. And if you have the desktop version of YouTube, which is the computer version, on the bottom you can see all those featured channels. And subscribe to Mr. Blue for You 972, Mr. Blue for You, this channel, Gerson's Random Stuff, the 4th channel, Emo Warrior Gerson, and Gerson Kitcher Jr. if you like puppets. And I will see you next time for Random Poem number 5, whatever that will be. And I will see you. Goodbye. Don't forget, don't live in fantasy. Live in reality. Take the good with the bad, and you'll be all right.